The guest we've all been waiting to hear, the man who called the crisis, a true son of liberty, someone who's been hitting the airwaves, hitting the radio waves since 2006 to let everybody know there's a collapse coming. Are they listening to him? No. Should they be listening to him? No. Should they have listened to him when he was talking about this? Is this a man who knows what he's talking about? Absolutely. And he's a friend of ours. He's a friend of the United States. His name, Mr. Peter Schiff. He's the president and founder of Europac, Euro Pacific Capital, here to talk to you.
I guess none of my clients are here. Actually, they're doing a lot better now, thanks. This year's been a lot better than last year. Well, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the Federal Reserve. You know, in a recent speech, President Obama blamed all the problems on the housing market. And in one of the speeches that George Bush made before he left office, I talk about a lot, he said that it's Wall Street's fault. Wall Street got drunk. Well, what everybody forgets is, sure, yeah, Wall Street was drunk. They were stinking drunk on Wall Street. Everybody on Main Street was drunk. The whole country was drunk. The question is, why? How'd they all get drunk? Where'd they get the alcohol? Well, it all came from the Fed. The Fed liquored everybody up, and now they're surprised at the way we acted, at the decisions that were made, about the risks that were taken. The Federal Reserve was behind all of it. And we're not going to get to the root of our economic problems unless we get to the root cause, which is the Federal Reserve and the phony monetary system that we now have.
Yes, sir.
I want to talk a little bit about where the Fed came from, because probably not many people understand the origins. You know, the Federal Reserve started in 1913, which means, number one, the nation made it all the way to 1913 without a Fed. Right? We had an industrial revolution without the Federal Reserve, so we don't necessarily need the Federal Reserve. Now, what was it like before the Fed? Well, first of all, you have to understand what Federal Reserve notes are. You know, what we all have in our pocket. We don't have dollars in our pocket. We have Federal Reserve notes. And what are they? Well, it's a note. And a note is a promise to pay. It's an obligation. So when you own a Federal Reserve note, you own a liability of the Federal Reserve. Well, what does the Federal Reserve owe you? If you have a $5 Federal Reserve note or a $100 Federal, what does the Fed owe you? Well, it doesn't owe you anything. So in effect, it's an IOU nothing. But that's not how it all got started. You see, in the United States, money is gold and silver. That's what money is. Money has intrinsic value, and our founding fathers understood that. When they wrote the Constitution, they established gold and silver as money in the United States. And they gave the federal government the power to coin money, which meant take gold and silver and make coins out of it. That's all they could do. But commerce also was conducted with money substitutes. Money substitutes are pieces of paper, currency, note currency, that are redeemable in actual money, being gold. And what happened is, before the Federal Reserve came around, banks issued their own currency. We had currency all over the country. Banks in different cities issued notes. And so what would happen is, if somebody wanted to borrow money, if a businessman wanted to borrow money, he'd go to a local bank. Maybe he needed to borrow, $5,000 to start a business. And so what he would do is he would take out a loan by signing an IOU to a bank, giving that bank an IOU for $5,000, give him some collateral, maybe the deed to his house or some personal property, and that bank would issue banknotes, right, which were redeemable in gold that bank had on deposit. And now that individual could take those notes, that currency, note currency that was created by a private bank, and use it to buy goods and services, to pay his workers, to grow his business. Now, what happened in 1913, there was a movement to have a national bank, a Federal Reserve. It wasn't part of the government, it was a private banking organization. And the mission of the Federal Reserve was to improve the quality of that note currency. Because what would happen is, let's say I got some currency, I got some banknotes from a bank in New York, and what if I traveled to California and I wanted to spend it? Well, what if someone in California doesn't know about this bank? What if they don't trust it? Or what if the bank shut and the person in California doesn't even realize that that bank is out of business? So the whole idea was, let's have one national bank that was going to issue currency that was superior to the currency that was in circulation. So when they passed the Federal Reserve Act, all Federal Reserve notes had to be backed 100% by commercial paper, which was the loans that were given, and 40% by gold. So for every Federal Reserve note in circulation, there was gold behind it. And the Federal Reserve notes were promises to pay. If you got an old Federal Reserve note and it says, this note is redeemable and lawful tender at any Federal Reserve bank, and the legal tender was gold or silver. And so what happened once the Federal Reserve was created, if that entrepreneur went to the bank to borrow money, instead of that bank issuing note currency in its own name, it would take that piece of paper, that commercial paper, that IOU from the borrower, and it would rediscount it to the Federal Reserve. And the Federal Reserve would issue its currency, and then it would pay the loan in Federal Reserve notes instead of its own notes. And the bank's profit was the difference between what it paid the Federal Reserve and what it charged the borrower. And so what happened is now, instead of having banknotes circulating from hundreds of different banks, we all had banknotes from one bank, the Federal Reserve. But they were still notes. It wasn't money, it was a substitute. It was redeemable in money. And it's interesting that government debt in the original Federal Reserve Act was not considered good collateral. The Federal Reserve was not allowed to buy government bonds in the original charter. So it was created to provide a better system of note currency. And also, one of the reasons that they wanted the Federal Reserve is they wanted an elastic money supply. And what an elastic money supply meant was that as economic activity expanded, as business activity expanded, the money supply would expand to meet the needs of business. And then as business activity contracted, the money supply would shrink. And so the money supply would expand and contract with business activity. And that was a reason for the Federal Reserve, to have an elastic money supply. Well, none of the original missions of the Federal Reserve exist today. I mean, first of all, in the First World War, the government wanted to pay for the First World War with inflation. And that's when they amended the Federal Reserve Act to enable the Federal Reserve to buy government debt. That was the first time they were able to do that. And once they started doing that, the Federal Reserve really became nothing more than an engine of inflation, because it kept perpetually buying government bonds and printing money, which is something that Congress couldn't do. The Constitution doesn't give Congress the authority to print money. I mean, the Federal Reserve had it, but they weren't printing money. They were issuing notes. They were issuing liabilities. The money was the gold and silver that they had in their vaults. And backing every Federal Reserve note was all that commercial paper. So there was real value to the notes. Today, the Federal Reserve notes have no value at all. They're not backed by anything. They're not redeemable in anything. They are of lower quality than the lowest quality banknote that was in circulation prior to 1913. So what's the point? What's the point of having the Federal Reserve? And now, instead of having an elastic money supply, where money supply contracts when the economy is contracting, like now, the Fed should be contracting money supply. Money supply never contracts. They just keep on growing it. When the economy is expanding, they print money. And when it contracts, they print it even faster. So all we have now is an engine for inflation. And if the Federal Reserve Act had originally been proposed in its current form, it never would have been approved. We never would have had a Federal Reserve enacted had it had these powers. But that's how the government works. You know, you get your nose under the tent, the camel's nose under the tent, and the government constantly usurps more power. So I think what we really need to do is either go back to the original mission of the Federal Reserve or abolish it completely. Because we don't want the government to be able to create money out of thin air. We don't want the government setting interest rates. And we don't want the government basically blackmailing private citizens into doing things that they might not want to do, like we just saw recently with Bank of America, where you have Henry Paulson and Ben Bernanke acting together, and they shouldn't even be acting together when the Federal Reserve is supposed to be completely independent of the government, but they're acting together, and now they're talking to a private citizen, basically ordering this individual to commit securities fraud, to withhold information from Bank of America shareholders, and to go through with an acquisition